All right, now we are recording, and I put the furry miscreant down. Goodbye. All right, so welcome to Cooler Than Hutton. Hutton, I've been wanting to do this for at least a year now because I have thrown shade at Cold Steel because Cold Steel is probably the worst thing Hutton published, in my opinion. M may disabuse me of that later. Hutton is an interesting figure. And one of the things I absolutely hate about Hutton is not his fault. It's the weird hagiography that has grown around him, as opposed to taking him in his context and as who he is. So, without further ado, I'm going to pin M. If you do me and everybody watching a favor and introduce yourselves. And the rest of us are going to bug you with questions in a little bit. So I'm gonna mute myself and go to town. Tell us who you are and what we should know about Hutton.
Oh god, that is not a small topic. So I'm M or Emerald. So yeah, I've been doing Hutton's fencing for since 2006. Starting in 2009 and finishing in 2011. I actually wrote my honours thesis on the role Hutton played in kind of supporting the British Empire and how he related to the culture of empire at the time. I've since continued fencing and also researching Hutton stuff and also Victorian era fencing in general. So looking at really very specialized to the late 19th century. But I think it is important that you at least have someone who is specialized, and this seems to be the thing that I'm specialized in. I also coach at the Old Sword Club in Sydney, as you can possibly maybe not guess from my accent. And yeah, that's kind of like me in a nutshell. So yeah, just one thing I will flag now. I have this really bad tendency to use a lot of theoretical terms or a lot of obscure terms. I'm trying to normalize people, or the onus being on the person who uses a term to clarify its meaning. So if I use a term that either you don't know or you think that the audience might not know, just like hit me up, ask me to define it because yeah, I have a bad habit of being overly obtuse. But yeah, so
Let me jump in there real quick, just as a housekeeping thing. Under
mm,
reactions, there's a raise hand. If you don't know a term and you do a raise hand, I'll be the rude jerk who interrupts M, and we'll get the question to you. Okay, thanks, M.
awesome, no problem. So yeah, let's Hutton. So yeah, he's a weird one because I think there is this incredible mythology around him in HEMA. I guess I'm going to do a very like lecturer thing. I am actually I work at a university, so that's probably part of the course. But um, and sort of talk about the historiography of it before we get into the actual like history. And so historiography just being history of history, but basically Hutton kind of came on the HEMA scene quite early. I think Cold Steel was digitized in like 1999, which for reference is like a full 5 years before Google Books was even announced. So it's a PDF that's been around for an incredibly long time. And he was sort of propagated not through the people who are maybe doing like classical fencing and then looking further back at like the manuals that their systems were based on, but more by medievalists who kind of saw him as the first humorist and kind of created this mythology around him as this like kind of gentleman of leisure who was doing humor like before it was cool, back in the Victorian period. And they also sort of present him as this kind of last bastion of like practical battlefield whatever sword fighting, um in the face of intense sportification, the latter being kind of the funniest because Hutton, chiefly, if you look at academic histories of him, you look at like things like the Oxford Dictionary of Biography, it lists Hutton as his primary achievement being the guy who really established modern fencing in Britain. Like he set up the Amateur Fencing Association, which then became the British Fencing Association, which is now Fencing Britain. And he did a lot to promote and propagate what is essentially modern fencing, or what became modern fencing in Britain. And so yeah, it's sort of he also did a lot to try and regulate and standardize it as a sport. like if you look at, say, Cold Steel, and you compare essentially the bouting conventions and the rules in Cold Steel to say just John Musgrave Waite's section. Waite basically has a short series of rules if there is a double who really should be counted as being the better fencer or who should get the point. Whereas Hutton has multiple pages on essentially how to run a tournament. And he also thinks you should be following these rules in your regular training. So when you're doing regular bouting, you should have a referee, you should be doing essentially a sport. And yeah, it's sort of, he's an interesting one because he was also very, very famous within the period. Like, we have a lot on him. There's a lot of writing, and I always feel very awkward talking about him, or making claims. I'm like, oh gosh, like I found quite a bit. I kind of crashed my computer earlier trying to open up all of the sources I've kind of bookmarked about him. And I still keep finding stuff still pops up. Most of it is fairly similar. Occasionally you see things that are new or shed some new light on stuff. I found out like literally today that apparently he was actually quite influential in the adoption of thrusting swords by the British cavalry. Like, one of his obituaries actually credits him with that, which I found quite interesting. But yeah, he's sort of this, quite complicated in many ways. I think quite human figure. I think like a lot of, if we want to really understand him, we should understand him more as a person rather than kind of like, the uwu first humorist visionary, or this, I don't know, like nincompoop who didn't understand the first thing about whatever sort of your HEMA related special interest is. But rather, like, we should see him as a person in his period who, he did a lot of very good things. He had a lot of achievements. He also did some things not particularly well. He is a 19th century well, he's not even a historian, he's an antiquarian. In 19th century histories are not really not really at the same standard of what we have today in terms of historians as a profession. So yeah, I don't know, like, it's really hard to sort of pin down where you should start with him, because there is just a lot there. I mean, I guess if I was going to summarize how people should see him, you should see him as one of the key figures in establishing modern fencing in Britain, who was also doing essentially a proto form of HEMA, mostly for the purposes of theatre, and was also an imperialist. He was like, one of his primary reasons for promoting fencing was that he felt that Britain would be a much more successful empire if its military was better supported by a strong domestic fencing scene. But by the same token, he was also responsible for expanding fencing to people, like groups that hadn't done it before. The Alfred Hutton Cup was actually a prize for women's foil because Hutton was hugely influential in promoting fencing to women. And also, like, he also expanded into school programs. It's kind of hard to sort of like find a starting point because there is so much there. I think he's very, very different from a lot of other figures who wrote manuals, because whereas, a lot of cases we know, you have someone like, say, Fiore de Libre, where we know a little bit about who he was other than the manual he wrote, but really not very much. Whereas with Hutton, it's really the opposite. Is we know a lot about him because, even by the standards of the time, he was a very public figure. Like, newspaper records are filled with references to him. And, as a bit of fun trivia, there is actually, he's one of three notable people named Alfred Hutton. The other one was a Liberal MP who was in Parliament a little bit after he died. And then the other famous Alfred Hutton was a carpenter from the north of England who was charged with drunken misconduct, but obviously to the extent that it made the papers. So I don't know what he did, but it was obviously newsworthy. But yeah, so like, I don't know, I might turn it over to questions to see where people want to start, like whether you want me to talk about Hutton's fencing, you want me to talk about like his contributions to like the history of fencing in Britain, about like his place in empire. Yeah, it's a really big topic. I don't know how much we're going to cover. So if anyone has any questions or anything they specifically want me to address, we can kind of go from there. Or I can just like,
If people are going to be shy about that, I definitely have a question that touches to his fencing, but I'd definitely also like to get him in a historical context if possible. So Hutton vis-a-vis the empire, Hutton as a person, as well as the fencing. I can throw out the question now if it helps you to formulate structure. If anybody else wants to jump in with something, they're welcome to as well.
Yeah, all right, well, like, yeah, so I mean we can talk about his fencing. I've got a question. Do you want to just unmute yourself and ask now, or
Yeah, go for it, George.
Okay, thanks. I would like to know a little bit about his, let's say, influence on the British society. So, how was his approach to culture or evaluate the domestic fencing scene? This is the topic I'm interested in because there's a similar approach basically also in Germany, and I'm diving in that one as a hobby of my one. So I think it would be nice to compare that one to be honest from my. So that's why I'm curious about that one. Can you elaborate on that topic maybe a little bit further, please?
oh, definitely. Yeah, and there's like, because there's a lot of similarities between what's going on in Britain in terms of the way they're re-engaging with their history and what happens in Germany. So I'm going to use the term Romanticism a lot. Just Romanticism was a movement that starts around the start of the 19th century. So really kind of as a reaction to the Enlightenment, what they saw as the cold rationalism of the Enlightenment, where they wanted to re-engage with emotions, re-engage with natural beauty. They're very, very pro sort of like organic communities and things that had like kind of a huge emotional weight. Initially, it was a fairly progressive movement, and then basically with the rise of Napoleon, became quite a often like generally quite a conservative movement in terms of how it was engaged, like just what it saw, what the world needed. It became so big and so popular that eventually it just became so influential that it was very, very hard to see where sort of Romanticism as a genre of poetry or art or like a motif that people would engage in sort of ended, and where like whatever else began. Like it just became so many things that it stopped being a specific thing. But where it's kind of relevant to Hutton, and also like in terms of like the German Romantics, because it was a big movement right across Europe, was they were very, very interested in particularly the Middle Ages and history. And so a lot of ideas of like medievalism, of, you know, knights and King Arthur, or like the works of Walter Scott, like the first essentially historical fiction writer, all spring out of the Romantic movement. And there's this sort of romantic kind of or like romantic motif all through the Victorian period. And with like the 19th century, there's like this real interest in the Middle Ages. This is where you start to see medieval symbolism appear. This is where you get, I guess, what's termed the invention of tradition. So a lot of what we think of as very, very old traditions revolve around like particularly royalty or coronation that we think of as fundamentally medieval actually stem from the 19th century. Probably the most controversial ones is a lot of our ideas of Scottish identity, like the Scottish Highlands, the formalized tartans, the Scottish national costume. In fact, most national costumes all come from this period, and they were functionally invented as a way of asserting kind of national identity, or kind of as creating a sense of relationship to the past. And so where you get people like Hutton coming in is Hutton is very, very interested in the history of fencing. He's a bit of a theatre kid. There's actually, I've found a newspaper article recently from 1882, which is a bit before he really came into public interest, talking about his performance in a play. Apparently, he was a decent actor. But he did some amateur theatre before he kind of really went full send on being a fencing master. But yeah, he really kind of tied fencing into history, into like the history of knights and chivalry, but also like swashbuckling, like rapier fencing, like sort of Three Musketeers, like Alexander Dumas kind of stuff. And that was incredibly successful. There was a huge appetite for it in Victorian Britain that really just wasn't properly being tapped. Like King Arthur, like Arthurian stories were very, very popular. Chivalry, like medieval images, like coats of arms, military symbols with like medieval style swords, or like medieval helmets, knightly helmets, sort of things, were becoming more and more popular, and particularly as a symbol of empire. So you have the British, or like the British soldier in the empire, wanting to present themselves as kind of the descendant of the medieval knight. And Hutton really kind of keys into that with essentially his early email, where he's like, oh, like, look at all of these interesting, manuals. This is how they were fencing. He essentially creates very, very simplified versions of like medieval and Renaissance fencing. So, he has a simplified longsword system, a simplified sword and buckler, simplified rapier, and then he also has the way he talks about small sword is really interesting, because he actually does see it as just an adjunct to sort of foil and epee. But he does like he uses particularly like Domenico Angelo's manual as a way of saying, oh, look, you can also use this with a dagger or a cloak as an offhand weapon, and here are some grapples. And a big part of this is he's conjuring up this kind of, like, he's really inspiring people's imaginations, where they're, essentially seeing themselves as swashbucklers and doing kind of basically, like, I don't want to say LARP, but like, how a lot of fantasy fiction today, like you read Tolkien, and a big part of that is it conjures up the imagery of medieval Earth and this sense of this, pseudo medieval society. Hutton was doing that, and there was, and explicitly as a way of promoting fencing. And this was very, very successful. He would go out, he'd do these big historical displays, and at the end of it, there'd be, oh, and here's some modern weapons you can do. Why don't you sign up to your local fencing club? And this was huge. This was, like, fairly successful. This was also how epee was promoted through Britain. The British actually got really good at epee up until that, between sort of like 1900 and up until World War One. The Brits were actually quite successful at epee in international competitions. I think in the 1908 and 1912 Olympics, the British men's epee team got silver in both. That all sort of ended with World War One, because so many of Britain's fencers were also in the military. And also you have things like the PALS divisions, where whole sporting teams were basically signed up as a way of kind of creating some community pressure to enlist, which also meant that you had like whole sporting teams just devastated, because they would all be sent to, like, if their team was sent to like the Somme, or some other sort of disastrous battle. And so Britain got briefly good at epee, and then that all died with World War One, and was also quite successful at women's foil. And that lasted up until sort of around the early 30s, when just like the lack of kind of critical mass of a fencing community in Britain kind of caused it to peter out. But yeah, I guess to go into where the Romanticism kind of plays into empire is this idea called romantic imperialism. So one of the ways you get people to support empire and to enlist is you get them to basically have these narratives of adventure, of, like almost sort of fantastic narratives, where they're going out and they are this kind of epic hero in this kind of imperial struggle, and really kind of move people away from the geopolitics of it and towards kind of seeing yourself as the hero in an action movie. And there are a lot of parallels with sort of modern recruitment techniques. Like, this is something that the Victorians certainly pioneered, but is something that is still very much within sort of military recruitment today. And what's really interesting is that like those kind of pulp stories and those fantastic adventures would incorporate sort of, this really romanticized idea of the Middle Ages, the knight going out and, fighting the good fight, but they'd also include stories of British soldiers and also frontiersmen. So people like explorers, particularly I live in what is essentially a former British colony, and explorers are quite prominent in our education system still, because that was a big thing in terms of or a big part of like British popular culture in the founding of Australia, was to encourage people to go out and explore like different parts of the world. And like you still see this as a motif in a lot of fiction today. I mean, probably the best example is Tintin. If anyone's read like Tintin comics, that's the same thing of going to an exotic place and being the hero in a struggle. And what's really interesting about the Victorian period is the way they present, the contemporary British soldier is very, very similar to the way they would present like, a noble knight or a swashbuckler. And so there's that kind of romanticism of seeing yourself as the hero, or like getting young men to see themselves as the hero of a story, where they're then going out and doing the work of empire, and thinking it was this sort of great, and building this sort of heroic mythos around it. And my understanding is like that's very, very similar to things that were happening in Germany, like the German Romantics, and my understanding like cowboy stories, like stories of the Old West, were even very, very popular in Germany for the same reason. So yeah, it's kind of a condensed version of it. I mean, this is also like a very, very big topic that we could spend we could easily spend a few hours talking about that alone, but yeah, it's kind of my best to condense it.
Francois?
Yeah.
Yes. Let me get my notepad. So we touched on this a bit earlier, about how Hutton seems to say that there's something wrong with the British fencing scene, which, especially in his time as he comes in, he's like, well, this is not popular, there's nothing happening there, which is very much a contrast of what's happening in France, where it's a very vibrant scene, which is like where I look at. So from Hutton's perspective, as he comes into this British fencing scene, when he's just, well, I say just starting, but as he's coming into his own as a fencing master, how does he pose his diagnosis of what the British fencing scene is like? Specifically, how did we get there? And how did he propose to go and like fix it?
Yeah. So it's good you mentioned France, because like one of his things was he was drawing a lot of ideas and a lot of inspiration from the French. He actually went and he trained with a French master in Belgium at some point in the 1880s, even, as well as training with French trained masters in Britain. But yeah, so in terms of like, Hutton says, yeah, like British fencing has basically been, there are times when he says it's just stagnated, and then there are other times where he's out like, no, we've gone into decline, which is like, I think in the period probably had an even more dire kind of tone to it. This is the period where like most histories are positivist histories, where they see things as getting progressively better. Like Britain is seen as a more developed, and they use the term more developed country than their colonies, because they were more technologically advanced, more economically powerful. But yeah, like for Hutton to turn and say we've in Britain we've gotten worse at fencing, it's quite significant. Hutton never really gets into like, I guess what you call like analytical history. He's very good at redescribing accounts. But he never really he never goes into the reasons why history happens. He's very much an antiquarian. He just describes things. He's actually, in many ways, by the standards of like the 19th century fencing historians, Hutton does better by trying less hard, whereas you get like, say, Castle, or like Adolphe Courtney, like trying to kind of get a grand overarching narrative of the development of the history of fencing. Hutton usually just repeats or summarizes anecdotes and accounts. He republishes sources.
Yeah, because one of the things that like, because one of the things that every fencing master at the time does is like, oh, look at how ancient our history is as fencing. We all derive from what the Romans were doing, then from the medieval period and whatnot. And it's when you look into it, it's like, really?
Yeah, well, like Hutton's actually he's really interesting because his main source of inspiration when it comes like he looks much more recently. So for like foil and for foil and for point fencing, like thrust fencing, he looks mostly to the 17th and 18th century. With saber, he draws a lot of inspiration from the 18th century, where he generally quite rightly points out that in the 18th century, backsorting was a major sport in Britain. It was popular, it was professionalized. It was like it basically had the same kind of social, occupied the same social space as boxing. And Hutton's like, okay, this was the period where we Britons were really good at broadsword fencing. We had this big professional scene. We had a lot of famous fencers. We had this relatively sophisticated method of fencing. And then he's like, oh, and then since then we've kind of gotten worse. And he doesn't really, I don't think he's ever goes into why he thinks that is. And obviously, we can talk about now looking back that the main reason British fencing kind of went into decline through the 19th century was one actually no, he does cite people no longer wearing swords as a part of the decline of interest, which is accurate. Like there was a loss of interest in fencing in Britain, at least, and I think in a lot of places when people stopped wearing swords as a fashion accessory or as hypothetically for self-defense. But the other thing that happened that he doesn't really touch on is the decline of the backsorting scene means that there's a loss of interest because there's no longer this large industry and powerful social institution encouraging people to take up fencing, and it's broadly replaced by boxing. For whatever reason, boxing just becomes much more popular, and once you get into the early 19th century, backsorting still continues, and you still get like the old kind of head-splitting single stick happening as kind of like as a vestigial thing. That's kind of, it's still happening occasionally, like money still changes hands because of it, but there's no big like broadswording stars anymore. Like all of the big celebrity athletes are all boxers, or and this is also when you get the rise of cricket and rugby and also horse racing as major spectator sports. But yeah, in terms of what Hutton says to revitalize it, he's got a bunch of things. Like one is just to foster interest, to encourage people to be more excited about it. And he does that through like the aforementioned medievalism, where he's like, hey, look at this cool thing. You can go off and, you can do this sport where you can also imagine yourself as a swashbuckler, and he really kind of plays the fantasy aspect into that. But also he establishes institutions. So he was one of the key people responsible for establishing what is now Fencing Britain. Originally it was the Amateur Fencing Association, and then they decided to drop the amateur part and the requirements around amateurism because they wanted to let people professionalize as fencing instructors, although I think that was a little after Hutton's death. But yeah, he established that. He wanted to establish it as a school sport in what in Britain are called public schools, but everywhere else in the world are called private schools. So essentially like elite schools. And part of his rationale for that was, oh, well, these are, the boys who study here are going to go off and become officers in the military. Like, you can't really separate Hutton's efforts promoting fencing from his efforts, like his imperial efforts, even though like at times when things would have been easy to get something through the military, if you just kind of separate it from the civilian civilian fencing. Hutton has always said, no, he's very, very keen to include the civilian fencing scene at every step of the way. But he wanted to encourage it as school sport. He did also do a lot to encourage women to take up fencing as an athletic pastime as well.
And from my perspective, sorry. Good. Yeah, from my perspective, damn, sorry. I was kind of wanted to add to that, like from my perspective, from what's going on in France, he very much has a point of not wanting to separate military and civilian fencing, because what happens in France with around the same time with Joinville is basically France operates on a conscription system, and all the men that go to the army, they learn at least some basic fencing, some basic foil, and that creates a really large base, like in the civilian world in France, of people that just know how to fence. And so from that, you get people that go on and become instructors, and you have a large pool to draw from. So, I mean, much as the military might not be directly interested, like in civilian fencing, it's like, yeah, it's there. Like from my perspective, what I see going on, how French fencing interest is formed. It's very interesting to see that he's like, oh no, same thing that I'm seeing that was going on in France is saying, oh, that's something we should be doing.
Yeah, no, he's like drawing a lot of influence from the French, like a lot of inspiration from French fencing, and particularly in terms of building institutions. One thing he also wanted was a way of training instructors specifically. Like a lot of his disputes with Aldershot come down to them like wanting to get the military to train fencing instructors so that each regiment has a proper fencing instructor. Although what he also wanted was for regiments to have a commitment to employing existing British fencing instructors, so that fencing instruction in Britain could professionalize, and so there'd be like training programs. Because for him to become a fencing instructor in Britain, like a proper fencing master, was a lot more was a longer, more ad hoc process. Like you could do it, and there were British trained fencing instructors. But you know, it was a harder and longer process because you were learning kind of ad hocly. Also, there was no regulation of it, so like French fencing instructors in Britain were really highly valued, and like Hutton talks about at like say the London Fencing Club and at like more elite fencing clubs that are, you know, frequented by sort of you know, the upper crust of society. They actually import French fencing instructors. Like he was one of the few Britons who actually taught there, like taught at like elite, you know, at like elite fencing clubs. And then, you know, other fencing clubs might have someone who is a proper coach but has only kind of got there really in this very kind of ad hoc way. And then in a lot of cases, the people running fencing clubs were just enthusiasts who were just doing their best. Like one of the things you see, one thing that's really interesting about Britain in this time is, whereas like I get the sense from a lot of French sources, the manuals are in many ways documenting a living tradition that is mostly passed on through physical classes, whereas so much of British fencing is actually being like knowledge is being transferred through books, because there just aren't enough people to teach. And like there are a lot of commentary saying, oh, like most British fencers are learning from books. So yeah, it's sort of an interesting thing. The other thing, just to finish answering Chris, the other thing he does, other than just trying to copy, like, you know, sort of French institutions in Britain, is he also wants to like look back at the history of fencing. He wants to, there is like a national component as well, where he does want to re-engage British fencers with the British school of fencing. So that's why like Cold Steel focuses so much on the saber, even though, I mean, Hutton really, like, you read about when you hear about him and when people talk about him, they don't like, they mention saber occasionally, but you know, he's more known for his foil. He's more known for his foil if they mention a specific weapon. But he seems to just, he's one of those people who just does everything. Although in the period, most sportsmen did everything. Like John Musgrave Waite, for example, was also a fairly, like outside of being an accomplished foil fencer, was also a fairly accomplished boxer. I've completely forgotten his name. Who was the first British fencing champion when Britain actually had like national championships in 1898. So like, you know, quite late compared to other countries. Was also a boxing champion, for example. R.G. Allenson Wynne played like a whole bunch of different combat sports. And yeah, so it's a bit more normal for someone to be like high level at a bunch of different things back in the period. It's not like today where it's quite rare that you even get like, you know, high level fencers who compete in different weapons. But yeah, what Hutton wanted to do is re-engage Britain with its own fencing history and sort of reignite the British school of fencing, which is why like Cold Steel is, you know, primarily a saber manual, even if it does cover other weapons, because when Hutton looks back at British history, and this is a pretty consistent theme you see, is going back really up until the point where the fencing is so different that it's not really worth considering, is Britain is importing small sword masters, importing point fencing masters, but for their broadsword, they're drawing on a domestic combat sport and a domestic fencing scene. And so that was kind of a very valuable thing. Hutton, because he's also trying to convince Britons to see some aspects of fencing as very British, and as British as major British sports like boxing or cricket, as well. So there's kind of like a nationalist component. Anyway, yeah.
Just to finish off before we move on to the next thing, going
Yeah.
back to professionalizing the British fencing instructor corps. It's very interesting, actually, to me that you will go and say that, because for across the pond, it's in France. You see instructors, fencing masters, sometimes even in books. I think I would have to go check back, but in Grisier it says like you can't make, like, I went to Britain and I couldn't make a living as a fencing instructor there because it's either too closed off or there's not enough interest. And that's before Hutton's time, of course. But it's I find it's interesting to see also descriptions of French masters going to Britain and seeing what their description of what it's like actually working there. And I know that that kind of just reminded me of that. So
yeah, well, like, so you see, I mean, you start to see more interest in the 1880s. Like, I think, like, Pierre and then Camille Prevost, both were French trained masters who were successful in Britain. But yeah, there's a lot of it where there's just not enough interest initially, and that's one of the big things Hutton is actually credited for. Like, you read his obituaries, and everyone's like, "This was the guy who got everyone into fencing in Britain," because I think this is very counterintuitive for a lot of people, but in like the mid 19th century, there was very little interest in fencing in Britain. It was very much a niche hobby. It's probably like fencing is probably more common in Britain today, like not counting HEMA, than it was at like some points in, well, definitely like in the mid 19th century. So yeah, it was a thing, and it was in many ways very difficult to get that interest again. Anyway, Russ, you've got your hand up.
All right, so I've got a question and I've got a hypothesis for it, and you're a specialist in the topic. So tell me what or where I go wrong in my understanding. So up until, let's say, the 1880s, certainly to 1882 for his saber stuff, what you see of Hutton in print is extremely conventional fencing by the standards of Britain in its day, to the point where it's not quite a simple rehash of the sword exercise, but if you blink twice, you could call it that. Then he trains on the continent for a little bit, and then all of a sudden he's this massive dilettante of fencing with his fingers in 6,000 pies. And the only ways I've had to understand this were either that's about the time he also gets seriously involved in the stage, and therefore he's training people in a lot of different weapons, or while he's training on the continent, he gets access to all the other Continental romantics who are pulling these things out of archives and discussing them, such as the big descriptions of baton, longsword, all these guys who are very clear about, for example, about what Telhofer's doing. And in further to Central Europe and Italy, when they're talking about what's going on with Fiore, they're ripping each other new butts for whether the quality of the translation was actually accurate and they were understanding it correctly, even if they didn't necessarily want to go back to antiquarian fencing. So is it more a case of he's trying to spread it to a certain area where the drill doesn't work much, or is it better to understand him as a popularizer for a lot of stuff he's getting exposed to on the continent when he trains there? Or have I missed the bus completely and there's a better way of understanding it?
I mean, so I guess we need to make a division between his modern, his saber stuff and like his essentially HEMA stuff, for lack of a better term. Yeah, if you've got a better term for it, I'd appreciate it. I might use the term historical fencing just because I think we do need to make a distinction between modern reenactment practices and what was happening in the Victorian period, because they were actually quite different. There's this wonderful article called Mimic Toil. I've completely blanked on the author, talking about, and basically the author is talking about like what the Victorians were doing that is similar to modern reenactment, but how it never seems to become a staple hobby. It never, like, it's a thing that they're very interested in the idea of like an immersive medieval experience, but outside of like plays and historical novels and the historical fencing scene, it never seems to take off. And my hypothesis for that is that just until you have Dungeons and Dragons, like immersive role-playing games, people wouldn't have the idea of actually just like acting out being in the Middle Ages. But that's kind of getting off topic. But in terms of what Hutton's doing between like sort of like the early 1880s, 1882, and then say 1889 with the publication of Cold Steel, or like 1892 with the publication of Old Swordplay. So in terms of like the historical stuff, I mean, most of the ideas he's getting from Europe is more he's seeing how much fencing is developing in France, and he's like, hey, we really should be doing the same thing in Britain. In terms of the things that are influencing the difference between what you're seeing in, basically he's recycled sort of Angelo Broadsword, where he's, you know, changing the guards, or like having staple engaging guards rather than like defensive guards and attacks. That's very much a product of things he would have most likely gotten in British archives, because he's working from particularly 18th century back sorting sources. He's also doing a lot of fencing that time. He's like, you know, during the 1880s, Hutton is becoming more and more active in the British fencing scene. He's teaching at the London Fencing Club, which is like one of the more prestigious clubs in Britain. I mean, at that point, it probably would have been like the most prestigious club. It was the one that did employ French trained fencing masters, for example. You know, he's just engaging a lot more, and he's getting a lot of ideas. But those ideas are coming primarily from his time in Britain. In terms of what he's learning in the continent, he learns épée. So he, I don't know whether he learned épée first in Belgium from a French trained master, or if he learned it at the London Fencing Club from other people who had gone over. But he does go over at some point. It would have had to have been after 1887. So we're looking at like 1887, 1888 to learn épée, then come back and write Cold Steel, and include an épée section, or about how to modify foil fencing to make it épée, which was kind of the fashion at the time. A lot of the manuals he is using, he is pulling out of British archives. So not just the English sources, but also like, as far as I know, he got Marozzo from an English archive, like an archive in England. And he's going over, I don't know what contact he has with the people doing essentially historical fencing in Europe before about 1894. But yeah, what happened, you know, he publishes Old Swordplay. He provides this kind of simplified method where your average fencing skill can start dabbling in like rapier, sword and buckler, and longsword. Of those, the rapier is really the only substantively useful one where you can actually fence with it. The sword and buckler section is essentially stage combat. It's a series of choreographed drills. The longsword is kind of halfway between, where Hutton basically says you can kind of fence with this, but you have to be super careful because there are no safe gauntlets. The problem with like hand injuries was very much a concern for Victorian historical fences, much like it is today. Yeah, that then gets noticed by people doing historical fencing, particularly in France, and they invite both Hutton and Castle to go to Belgium for a big performance, a big conference there in 1894. Which actually, if you check out the Long Edge fencing website, they actually have a translation of the run sheet for that, which is quite amazing. And there's some really incredible similarities, because you, particularly the sword and buckler section, is almost taken very directly from old swordplay, which probably means that was Hutton's contribution. But yeah, I don't know of any. I've never seen any evidence that Hutton has contact with, or substantive contact with, the people doing historical fencing in continental Europe before this point. Like, there's a very good chance that he got everything from historical archives that he could find in Britain itself, and he just happened across Italian language manuals, or he does make reference to some German language manuals as well, but he's not particularly keen on the German stuff. He might prefers Moroso and whatnot. So yeah, I've never seen any evidence of him going to the continent to find this stuff. Most even, or to find the stuff before he's already publishing on it. And then his publications is why he goes, because they're a lot of people are kind of hey, this is really cool and interesting, and you're doing good work, and so he gets invited over. Yeah, I've not seen any evidence that he actually that he traveled for the purpose of looking at historical stuff. And most of the evidence we do have of him traveling is going to particularly Belgium. For some reason, there's really strong fencing links between Britain and Belgium that I've yet to get around to exploring, and also to France. But yeah, in neither case, he doesn't really make that much. He doesn't make terribly many references to historical French texts. He has one reference to, I think, Lincourt in Cold Steel, where he has a very, very complicated grapple disarm where you trade hands, that he thinks is very cool and includes for the purposes of, novelty. But otherwise, yeah, there's not a lot of evidence of him going overseas to find these documents. There is considerable evidence that even the non-English documents that he's working from, he was able to get from British archives, because there are a lot of manuscripts that ended up, even though they're not in English and even though they originated in Europe, ended up in British archives, Royal Armoury's manuscript I-33 or 133 is in the Royal Armouries, which is in Britain. So yeah, even though it's a German language manual, it also includes a bit of Latin. So yeah, in terms of him traveling to work this stuff out, I don't know. I don't know how much contact he had prior to publishing old swordplay with the people doing the same things in the continent. And I do get the sense that it was a thing where a lot of different people doing it out of interest suddenly all found each other and kind of came together and just had a really good time. But yeah, there's no evidence that he went that he traveled to Europe to find this stuff before he had published on it.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Okay, who else has questions? We are definitely towards the bottom of the hour, if not quite there yet. So if you've got anything to kick in, Kat, what you got?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. So I was wondering if you could talk a little more about how he tried to promote fencing among women and how he tried to get ladies more interested in fencing.
Yeah, and I can definitely talk about that. So a big part of what he did is most of his public displays, when you read this, you see the historical displays, include a woman named Esme Beringer, who was a quite famous stage actress, and she was quite famous for playing fencing roles. She actually played Romeo in an adaptation of Romeo and Juliet, where instead of getting a teenage boy to play the role, they got a full-grown woman. So yeah, that's a big part of it, was just having having a woman publicly appear in these displays, because as we know, with any kind of promotion, if you can see yourself reflected in the people doing it, you're more likely to do it. That's why like representation does matter. It is a thing where if your club is entirely mask presenting, you're most likely going to recruit more mask presenting people, because it's going to be harder for anyone else to see themselves doing the activity. Whereas if you have women in your displays, women will join because they're like, oh, I can do that. This other woman's doing it, I can do it. That's kind of a huge thing, and that's kind of a big part of how he did it, is he made sure that women were included. There's also just basic things like running classes for women, being prepared to actually coach them. Just so that they could access actual instruction, because this is a period in history where there is a very intensive effort to have division between genders. So you have essentially you have essentially this idea that there is men's space and women's space, and there's not a lot of mixing. And so having someone just be prepared to say, all right, well, I will run classes for women, I will make sure that there is space for them at fencing clubs, really meant that you could provide this activity for women to do, and then start to build kind of a core of women fencers who could then go out and sort of make fencing more accessible to more women. That was a very major thing. Like, one thing I find very interesting is you look at depictions of women fencing in the period, and it is very, very rare to see mixed or open fencing. Most depictions of women fencing, they're fencing other women, including particularly in cases of classes, it's a whole class of women, and you can invariably tell because they also had a different fencing uniform that had a nice dress kind of thing, quite elegant, but very distinct. And yeah, they this is just providing that space and making sure that was included was really important. But Hutton did go out of his way to train women, not just in fencing, but also he trained a lot of actresses and a lot of people for stage, in stage fencing. The most famous of which again is Esme Beringer, who I suspect also probably played a much bigger role in the promotion of fencing to women, but as is often the case with women's history, it's usually a man who gets the credit as well. So I do suspect that there's a bit of Hutton getting the credit for Esme Beringer's work because he was her fencing master as well. But yeah, that's kind of the brief of it, I guess.
Anybody else? John, Izzo, questions? All right, so at the bottom of the hour for Cooler Than Hutton, in this case, Cooler Than Hutton, actual Hutton, I always ask the person, so why should we pay attention to this person? What's going on with them? In this case, we've had a very specific sort of question is recapitulated here. How would you like the historical fencing or HEMA community to understand this guy, given that you are a specialist in the literature who can't give people a 5-hour lecture series on it, at least until now that I've prompted it, and maybe you'll start doing that. Hit us with your elevator speech for how we should understand this guy.
I mean, one is, as a person, the thing that frustrates me about the way Hutton is presented in HEMA is it's some variant of great man history, where either he is the great visionary who first started HEMA and, justifies a whole bunch of things early HEMAists were doing, or he's, they create this weird inverse great man history where he's no, he was a complete nincompoop, he didn't understand anything. And it's neither is true. He was a very knowledgeable fencer. His sources were all very respected in period. I think if you want to understand British fencing in the 1890s and early 1900s, Hutton is a really good source because his books, particularly Cold Steel, were the principal text. Most people were reading them and referring to them when they were learning fencing. I don't know. I think in terms of how to approach him, he's quite helpful because he's got a lot of books that fill different niches. So if you want an introductory text to fencing, The Swordsman is a really good sort of introduction. Here's some drills. If you want a reference book, Cold Steel is amazing because it describes things very distinctly. It has nice pictures, and then it has a bunch of drills you can do to actually understand those things. If you want something real, like if you want something really basic, his earlier works are actually pretty good for that. You've basically got a coherent system where you have different sources that fill different purposes. Whereas I think in nearly every other period, you need to go to different authors, or like, you just don't have sources that fulfill particular needs. Whereas with Hutton, depending on what you want, there is always going to be something for you. So yeah, that's kind of my rough sketch of him and his fencing.
All right. Any parting words around the horn? All right. Thank you very much, Em. As per usual, I will bust butt to get this online as rapidly as possible. If fortune provides, that will even be today. So by the time you get up tomorrow, if all goes well, this will be online for people to see.
Oh, awesome. Well, I look forward to seeing it up.
All right. Thank you for attending, everyone. Thank you,
I'm
Em,
happy
for
we did
hosting
this.
for us.
Thank you for having me. It's been really fun. So yeah.
All right. Good morning to most of you and good night to Em.
I'm happy we did this actually because one of the things I think we achieved with Cooler and Hutton earlier is to say like, hey, Hutton was sucking out all the oxygen from the room for everybody else, and I think that overcompensated and seeing like, oh no, now we're seeing a lot more people saying Hutton didn't know anything, and I'm very happy that now we're able to at least help correct the record and say no, Hutton is also cool. Like, don't just throw Hutton in trash because we say there's other things.
Very much
Yeah,
so.
like kind of achieving that balance.
All right. I'm going to stop recording and y'all have a great day.